Have you ever noticed how men often look at women over 50 with a kind of puzzled expression, as if they've suddenly become unreadable? It's not because these women are hiding themselves, but because men are trying to decode them with the wrong lens. They are using the rules of youth to understand the logic of maturity. They are searching for signs of the woman who once craved approval, who once fought to be chosen, who once shaped herself to fit expectations. But she's no longer there. What stands before them is a woman transformed, layered with experience, sharpened by loss, enriched by wisdom, and unbothered by the gaze that once defined her. This is the paradox men cannot easily grasp, that a woman over 50 is not a diminished version of her younger self, but an entirely new being. She is not clinging to relevance. She is creating a new definition of it. She is not desperate for love. She is discerning about it. She is not waiting to be validated. She validates herself. And this shift unsettles men who have been taught to believe that a woman's value is tied to her desirability, her availability, her willingness to orbit around male approval. Men can't fully understand the psychology of women over 50 because they are still trained by a culture that celebrates youthful femininity but rarely honors mature womanhood. They see beauty as bloom, not as endurance. They see passion as fire, not as embers that warm with depth. They see worth as attention, not as presence. And so when faced with women who no longer seek validation, who no longer chase, who no longer care to play the old game, men stand bewildered. But beneath this bewilderment lies something deeper: fear. Because when a woman over 50 stops playing by the rules, she exposes the fragility of those rules. She reveals that desire is not the same as power, that silence can be louder than pursuit, and that solitude can be stronger than dependency. She shows men that she no longer needs them in the way society told her she must, and that truth cuts at the heart of male conditioning. The psychology of women over 50 is not about rejection of men, but about reclamation of self. After decades of pouring into families, partners, careers, and communities, these women begin to pour back into themselves. They awaken to their own needs, dreams, and unfinished business. They choose solitude if companionship diminishes them. They choose depth over distraction. They choose truth over performance. And this self-centering is something men, conditioned to be the center of women's lives, often mistake for arrogance, coldness, or distance. But in reality, it is liberation. It is a woman refusing to betray herself any longer. It is a woman recognizing that love without reciprocity is not love. It is a woman deciding that she will no longer beg for crumbs when she deserves a feast. Men may interpret this as hardness, but it is clarity. They may call it bitterness, but it is strength. They may see it as withdrawal, but it is expansion into the self. Carl Jung once said that what we deny in ourselves, we project onto others. Many men deny their fear of irrelevance, their dread of aging, their resistance to vulnerability. When confronted with women who embrace these truths with grace, they project judgment onto them. They call them invisible, cold, or past their prime. In doing so, they miss the extraordinary beauty of what is unfolding. A woman in her 50s stepping into her own psyche with courage. Men often misunderstand because they are looking for the same scripts that worked in youth: charm, pursuit, promises, flattery. But those scripts fall flat on women who have already lived enough to see through them. A 50-year-old woman does not melt at hollow gestures. She has heard them all before. What she seeks, if she seeks anything at all, is authenticity, real presence, reciprocity. And these demands terrify men who have relied on performance instead of depth. So why can't men understand the psychology of women over 50? Because they confuse freedom with loss. They see her solitude and assume loneliness. They see her discernment and assume coldness. They see her refusal to chase and assume she has given up on love. They cannot yet grasp that her life is no longer centered around being chosen, but around choosing herself. This is not to say that women over 50 are beyond love, intimacy, or partnership. Far from it. But the difference lies in the quality of love they will accept. They are no longer impressed by superficiality. They no longer tolerate neglect disguised as love. They no longer give themselves away for the illusion of security. If love comes, it must come as an equal, not as a rescuer, not as a controller, not as a role to be performed. And until that happens, she is content to walk alone. Men struggle to understand because society has not prepared them to. Women over 50 are rarely represented in media as powerful, desirable, or whole. They are sidelined into caricatures: the grandmother, the lonely spinster, the bitter divorcee. Yet in reality, they are healers, creators, leaders, visionaries. They are women who have faced heartbreak, betrayal, loss, and aging, and emerged not weaker but stronger. Their psychology is not a mystery to those willing to listen, but to men trapped in old conditioning, it feels like a riddle with no answer. And perhaps that is the real reason men cannot understand, because to understand, they would need to confront their own shadows. They would need to admit that they too fear invisibility. They too cling to youth as proof of worth. They too struggle with the idea of being enough when the chase is over. And to admit that is to dismantle the very structures that once placed them at the center. Women over 50 expose a truth men have long avoided: that love is not about possession, but presence. That power is not about dominance, but self-mastery. That worth is not given, but claimed. And once a woman reaches this understanding, she becomes unreadable, not because she is complicated, but because she is finally clear. This clarity is what men mistake for mystery. This wholeness is what they call distance. This self-possession is what they interpret as coldness. In truth, it is none of these things. It is simply a woman stepping fully into her second life, no longer chasing, no longer bending, no longer waiting to be seen. She sees herself. And that is a power no man can easily comprehend, because it is a power no man can control. To understand why men struggle to grasp the psychology of women over 50, we need to begin with the scripts they are taught from an early age. Men are often socialized to see women primarily through the lens of youth and beauty. From advertisements to films, women are celebrated when they are young, fertile, vibrant, and visibly desirable. Their image is used to sell products, to capture attention, to embody fantasies. But what happens when a woman ages out of this narrow definition of desirability? To many men, she becomes a puzzle. They cannot reconcile the woman before them with the myth they were trained to believe in. This cultural blindness explains why so many men interpret women over 50 as invisible. But the invisibility is not natural, it is constructed. It is the result of male-centered narratives that do not know how to honor women outside the context of youth. And when a woman no longer seeks approval, when she no longer plays into the game of being seen to validate her worth, her silence feels like a void men cannot decode. But to the women themselves, this invisibility is not a curse. It becomes a cloak of freedom. No longer watched as closely, no longer burdened with the same expectations, they begin to reclaim their inner lives. They read more, travel more, deepen friendships, explore spirituality. They redirect energy once spent on being attractive into being authentic. For many, it is the first time they feel truly free to live without the constant gaze. And this is precisely what men cannot understand, that what appears to them as withdrawal is in fact expansion. Jung's psychology gives us a lens here. He described midlife as the moment when the unconscious demands balance. The extroverted young woman, always outwardly focused, begins to explore inwardness. The nurturer begins to nurture herself. The woman who defined herself through others begins to meet her own shadow, her own unlived desires, her own inner masculine, the animus. This inner shift creates a woman who no longer seeks wholeness outside, but within. And when she appears to stop chasing love, what she is truly doing is chasing herself. Men, however, have not been trained to see love in these terms. For many, love is still about possession, conquest, validation. It is still tied to youth, to beauty, to performance. They misunderstand a woman's refusal to chase as rejection of them, rather than recognition of herself. They assume she is cold, when in fact she is simply unwilling to be consumed. They assume she has given up on love, when in fact she has discovered a deeper form of it, one that begins with self-respect. Another layer of misunderstanding comes from men's fear of aging. Women over 50 often carry their years with resilience. They have endured losses, marriages that ended, children who grew up, parents who passed away, bodies that changed. They have had to adapt again and again, and that adaptation gave them strength. Men, on the other hand, often experience aging as a direct threat to their identity. The loss of virility, of professional dominance, of being desired, all of this unsettles them. And when they see women over 50 embracing their maturity rather than clinging desperately to youth, They feel confronted by their own inability to do the same. This confrontation creates projection. Men label these women as difficult, bitter, or unapproachable, not because they are, but because it is easier than admitting envy or insecurity. It is easier to dismiss what one does not understand than to re-examine the beliefs that make it confusing. And so the gap widens. Women over 50 grow more self-possessed, while men retreat into old stereotypes, unable to bridge the psychological distance. Yet there is another reason men can't easily grasp the psychology of mature women. They underestimate the depth of female memory. A woman in her 50s carries decades of lived experience. She remembers every betrayal, every dismissal, every time she was told she was too much or not enough. She remembers the years she poured herself into others without reciprocity, and this memory becomes wisdom. She no longer tolerates what she once did. She no longer excuses behavior she once justified. This kind of clarity is intimidating because it requires men to meet her with maturity, honesty, and accountability. Charm alone is no longer enough. For many men, this new standard feels unreachable. They may try to return to the scripts of their youth, only to discover those scripts no longer work. The jokes fall flat. The compliments feel empty. The promises sound recycled. To truly connect with a woman over 50, they would need to evolve, to shed performance and meet her with truth. But this level of evolution is not something society prepares men for, and so they misunderstand. They call her hard to please when in fact she is simply unwilling to be deceived. Consider also the spiritual dimension. Women over 50 often turn inward not just psychologically, but spiritually. They explore meditation, prayer, philosophy, creativity. They begin to see love not as a single relationship, but as an energy that flows through all areas of life. A sunrise becomes as nourishing as a compliment. A deep conversation with a friend becomes as fulfilling as a date. Self-expression becomes as satisfying as romance. For men who still equate love primarily with partnership or sexual conquest, this expanded definition is baffling. How could she be fulfilled without a man? How could she radiate without being chosen? The question itself reveals the depth of misunderstanding. The truth is, women over 50 are not rejecting men. They are rejecting the narrow roles men once demanded they play. They are rejecting invisibility as weakness. They are rejecting dependency as destiny. They are rejecting the notion that love is something to be begged for. And in doing so, they are creating a psychology men cannot easily map, because it does not orbit around men at all. This is the radical shift. Women over 50 are no longer defined by external validation. They are defined by internal alignment. They stop chasing because they have caught something greater, themselves. They no longer burn out proving they are worthy of love. They embody love in how they live. And to men still trapped in a worldview where women exist primarily to give, serve, or please, this autonomy feels alien. It feels like a loss of control. It feels like a mystery too complex to solve, but it is not a mystery. It is simply freedom. Men's misunderstanding of women over 50 is not only personal but cultural. Entire social systems reinforce the idea that women exist for the male gaze, and when that gaze shifts away, men assume the woman has lost value. But the woman herself knows otherwise. She begins to live a life that no longer bends toward external validation, and this radical recentering is something many men cannot fathom, because they have never been trained to see women as autonomous beings outside of relational roles. For much of history, a woman's identity was defined in relation to a man, daughter, wife, mother, widow. Even language reflected this. Her worth was measured by her proximity to male approval, male protection, male inheritance. Although society has progressed, many of these archetypes still linger in the unconscious. So when a woman over 50 refuses to be defined this way, choosing solitude, independence, or non-traditional partnerships, men struggle. It destabilizes an old narrative that said women must always orbit around men to matter. This is where Jung's ideas about archetypes become useful. In youth, women are often expected to embody the maiden archetype, youthful, desirable, full of potential. Later, they may be pushed into the mother role, nurturing, sacrificing, devoted to others. But once a woman passes 50, these archetypes lose their hold. She is no longer maiden, no longer mother in the same way. Instead, she begins to embody something closer to Jung's wise woman, a figure who is self-possessed, inwardly connected, and aligned with the deeper truths of life. Men, however, are often unprepared to encounter this archetype. They do not know how to relate to a woman who no longer seeks their approval, but instead embodies her own authority. This inner authority is not loud or aggressive. It does not announce itself with fanfare. Rather, it is quiet, steady, unshakable. A woman over 50 who knows herself is like a mountain, immovable by shallow winds, indifferent to fleeting storms. Men who are accustomed to women bending, appeasing, and adjusting may feel powerless before such presence. They may even accuse her of being cold, when in fact she is simply no longer willing to shrink. Another dynamic that confuses men is the way women over 50 redefine intimacy. In youth, intimacy was often tied to romance, sexuality, and constant validation. But with maturity, intimacy expands into new forms. It becomes about deep conversations, shared silences, mutual respect, and soulful companionship. A woman over 50 might prioritize emotional depth over physical attraction, presence over promises, authenticity over fantasy. For men conditioned to equate intimacy with conquest, this recalibration feels alien. They may assume she has lost interest in love, when in reality, she has gained a truer understanding of it. Add to this the fact that women over 50 often carry an earned skepticism. They have lived long enough to see through manipulation, to spot red flags, to identify false charm. A man cannot easily deceive a woman who has already endured decades of half-truths. She has learned from heartbreak, betrayal, disappointment. This skepticism does not make her bitter. It makes her discerning. Yet men who once succeeded with superficial gestures may interpret her discernment as rejection. They cannot understand that she is not rejecting men, but rejecting illusions. Furthermore, women over 50 are often reclaiming desires they suppressed in earlier decades. A mother who once sacrificed her ambitions for her children may return to school, write a book, travel, or launch a business. A wife who once poured herself into her husband's career may now pursue her own passions with unapologetic focus. Men sometimes misinterpret this as selfishness, but it is actually balance. Jung would call it individuation, the process of becoming whole by embracing the unlived parts of oneself. Men who do not understand this process may struggle to accept that a woman's fulfillment is no longer tied to serving them. And then there is the question of solitude. Few things unsettle men more than a woman who chooses solitude over partnership. From a cultural perspective, solitude in women has long been stigmatized. A man alone is seen as independent, but a woman alone is often labeled lonely. Yet many women over 50 actively choose solitude not because they cannot find love, but because they refuse to settle for less than they deserve. This voluntary solitude reflects strength, not weakness. But to men who expect women to always seek connection, it seems incomprehensible. They confuse her solitude with emptiness when, in fact, it is sanctuary. This misunderstanding also highlights men's discomfort with their own dependence. Many men rely on women for emotional support, nurturing, and domestic stability. When women over 50 withdraw from these roles, men feel exposed. They realize how much they depended on being mothered, tended, or validated, and instead of confronting this dependency, they accuse women of being distant or unloving. In truth, women are simply stepping back to give themselves what they once gave to everyone else. The psychology of women over 50 also challenges men's concept of time. Men often measure life by linear achievements, career milestones, financial success, physical vitality. Women, however, especially in their 50s, begin to measure life by cycles, by seasons of growth, release, and renewal. They recognize that endings are not failures, but transitions. Divorce is not always tragedy. It can be liberation. Retirement is not decline. It can be reinvention. Men who cling to linear narratives of achievement cannot easily grasp this cyclical wisdom. And so they misinterpret women's acceptance of change as resignation. But perhaps the most profound reason men cannot understand the psychology of women over 50 is because these women embody a truth men often fear, that love is optional but selfhood is not. Men are taught to see themselves as central to a woman's happiness. When they discover that a woman can be fulfilled without them, that she can thrive in solitude, flourish in creativity, and radiate without being chosen, it shakes the foundation of male identity. It reveals that male approval is not the currency they thought it was. And this revelation is unsettling, even threatening. In reality, women over 50 do not despise love. They still welcome companionship, intimacy, connection, but only if it enhances their already full lives. They are no longer willing to gamble their peace for the promise of affection. They no longer confuse attention with care or passion with commitment.